Have you all been following the story of Charlie Gard, the British infant who, I'm sorry to report, died tragically this morning? For those who don't know, just very much in a nutshell, he's a young infant, a baby boy who suffered from a rare genetic disorder that gave him very low chances of survival. Doctors in Britain in the NHS fought to save him, but they ruled that there was really no point continuing treatment because his chances of survival were so low. The thing about the case is, his parents, were willing to pull out all the stops to try to save him, trying out experimental treatments and things of that nature. Eventually, the hospital decided they weren't going to treat Charlie anymore. They were going to take him off life support and allow him to die, basically put him on palliative care, end of life care, until he passed away naturally. The parents, however, were willing to fight to keep him alive. Unfortunately, the courts in Britain consistently ruled, and I think they were eventually backed up by European courts, that the hospital had made a legitimate decision based on the medical unlikelihood that he could survive under any treatment. What I really don't fully understand and certainly don't agree with or approve of in this case is the fact that the British courts and the European courts even had the power, the legal authority, to stand in the way of Charlie's parents seeking to take him out of the country to the United States to undergo a different experimental treatment. This to me makes really no principled sense. An acquaintance of mine who happens to be a pediatrician, if I'm not mistaken, he's certainly a doctor, a physician, here in Canada, explained to me his reasons for agreeing with the court's decision. As far as he could tell, the chances of survival under any treatment was so low that it would actually have been almost a form of child abuse to continue to subject Charlie to further medical treatments. I know this much, the British courts definitely based their ruling on the idea that any further treatment would not be in Charlie's own best interests. But I don't think that decision should have been the courts to make. Now, it's possible, based on what I've read so far, that the courts simply ruled that it was legal for the hospital to withdraw life support from Charlie without necessarily ruling that the parents were not allowed to take him out of the hospital and take him out of the country to the United States to undergo experimental treatments that would be privately funded, largely by a crowdsourcing campaign that the parents launched. If that's so, then I think the ruling is a little bit easier to understand. It wasn't prophylactic. It wasn't so much preventing the parents from, again, pulling out all the stops to try to save their son, or preventing them from leaving the country physically, so much as simply allowing the British hospital to withdraw life support. However, if that's not the case, if the British courts actually were basically forbidding these parents to seek this alternative treatment, that to me is totally unjust. I agree that parents' ability to make these kinds of medical decisions for their children should not be absolute. For example, in cases where the parents might have some arcane or esoteric religious or perhaps even secular belief that tells them that certain life-saving medical procedures are immoral, should not be allowed to act on those beliefs in a way that puts the child in greater danger of dying or becoming sicker if the hospital actually has a life-saving or otherwise effective medical remedy that's available that they want to apply to the child. So, for example, if the parents are Jehovah's Witnesses, I guess, and they believe that blood transfusions are immoral because they're tantamount to drinking blood, and the baby or the child who's not old enough to make these decisions for himself or herself needs a blood transfusion in order to survive, and the hospital stands ready to give it, I think it makes sense for the hospital to have the legal authority to provide the blood transfusion over the parents' objections. However, in this case, it was a different story. In Charlie Gard's case, it was the hospital that actually wanted to let him die, and the parents who were willing to go the extra mile, above and beyond, to try to save him. I've heard a bit about the high unlikelihood that any medical treatment would have proven successful. However, at the end of the day, I don't think that it makes sense for the government to say we're actually going to more or less mandate that this child die over the objections of the parents. I think it makes sense for the government to be able to supersede the parents' wishes if they're doing so for the purpose of keeping the child alive, where the parents' preferences would actually cost the child his or her life. But in a case like this, where letting the government institution, the government-run hospital have its way would mean allowing the child to die, whereas letting the parents have their way would mean potentially, even if only theoretically, giving the child an additional chance at life, at survival, I'm sorry. This is not, in my view, the kind of case where the state's preference should supersede the parent's preference. Letting the state have its way meant costing him his life. And that's exactly what happened earlier today. So in this case, I have to disagree with the British court's decision. I've heard the arguments on the other side, at least some of them, and I understand them, and I respect them, but at the end of the day, I beg to differ. At least based on what I've seen so far, the information that I've seen so far, I would have to side with the parents. If the state wants to save a child's life over the parents' objections, then the state should be able to intervene. But if the state wants to let a patient die over the objections of the parents or next of kin or what have you, in that case, the state's preference should take a back seat. The state should have fallen.